It was the season of frustration for Bernie's lot, as the Brabham BT53 was clearly the only car in the same league as the McLarens for sheer speed, as evidenced by Nelson putting it on pole 9 times, but lacked the ability to finish races. Things improved a little for PK after the midpoint of the season, and from Britain onwards he finished more than he didn't, but by then any chance of putting together a title challenge had more or less evaporated. In Car 2, the Fabi brothers were always going to find it tough going, between Teo trying to jet back and forth between F1 and IndyCar circuits, and quickly admitting that was a mistake, and Corrado's lack of experience, and even under the best of circumstances, Brabham have effectively been a one-car team of late. Teo at least put in a great combative drive at Monza, and even squeezed some grudging applause out of the Tifosi for his trouble, but is reportedly unlikely to be kept on at Brabham. After losing Alboreto and their major sponsor at the end of 1983, Tyrrell had to start afresh in 1984, and for a while it looked promising. Both Brundle and Beloff looked like great finds as drivers, and assuming Martin suffers no long-term consequences from his accident, both could be major stars of the future. But then came the issue over the water tanks and the lead shot. The ensuing furore seems to have been at least as much political as it was sporting. Ken Tyrrell, the lone holdout against changing the fuel capacity regulations for 1985, and having made few friends in the paddock with his abrasive personality and constant protesting of this and that over the last couple of years. He will submit an entry for 1985, and we will see whether it is accepted, and if so, what form that will take. It's unlikely to be the end for this once great team, but it is certainly a new low point for them. Last year, the chassis was good, but the Ford engine was underpowered, and the team seemed to be treading water waiting for those Honda turbos. This year, the engine was good, if a little fickle, and it was the FW09 chassis that was the problem. It understeered drastically, and just couldn't put all the Honda's power on the road. That Rosberg won in Dallas is very much a testament to Keke's skill and determination, rather than the quality of the car. Once again, however, Jacques Laffite was largely missing in action. It didn't help that he had the lion's share of the technical faults, only finishing 5 times, but if he was seen on TV coverage at all, it was usually being lapped by the leaders as he circulated in midfield. It seems unlikely that the Never Say Die Mansell will have the same issue. 12 wins out of 16 and 4 1-2 finishes tell their own story. McLaren's domination of the 1984 season was record-breaking, eclipsing that of Mario Andretti's Lotus in 1978. As Clive James put it in the official FIA end-of-season review, anything as fast as the McLarens fell apart, anything more reliable finished later. The supreme organisational skills of Ron Dennis's team and the truly impressive Porsche-built engine combined to leave everyone else looking distinctly ordinary, especially when the McLaren still seemed to have plenty of fuel left while the other cars were coasting home running on fumes. Prost and Lauda seemed to hit it off immediately and have a genuine camaraderie, which will have helped too, and although Alain might well feel disappointed at missing out yet again, he seems to be genuinely pleased for Nicky, who eventually put pen to paper on a 1-year extension to his contract. Mike Ralph and John McDonald must really enjoy running a Formula 1 team because more tangible rewards have been distinctly thin on the ground. Having a turbo engine deal meant little when everyone else did too, and the Hart was probably the weakest of the field in that regard. Even then though, the Rams were usually found behind the normally aspirated Tyrrells, as well as the tiny underfunded Spirit team on the same engine. The chassis was the main culprit, and they soon found the car was quicker when they took the engine cover off, which they did for much of the season. Even then, Alio and Palmer were mobile chicanes for most of the season, when they weren't pulling off in the first 10 laps or so with some technical problem or another. Palmer was, as expected, the better of the two given his greater experience, and while Alio wasn't quite as badly obliterated as some predicted, he had plenty of cause to look gloomy at the end of the season. Neither driver is yet confirmed for 1985, and much will depend on whether the team themselves can find the funding to keep going. A huge step up for Lotus from a miserable 1983, with Elio De Angelis going from just 1 points finish last year to 3rd in the table this year thanks to an impressive scoring streak in the first 2/3 of the season, although things came a little unstuck towards the end with 4 retirements from 6 after Brands Hatch. Even so, Lotus flattered to deceive a little in 1984. Great qualifying performances including a front row lockout, too rarely translated into good race form, with the black cars usually slipping back down the order in the opening laps. The petty rivalry between the drivers, and Mansell's still frosty relations with manager Peter Waugh, didn't help. Nigel for his part made too many silly mistakes and often drove the car to destruction, and Waugh was delighted to capture Ayrton Senna to replace him for 1984, reportedly saying that Nigel Mansell will never win a race as long as I have a hole in my arse. Another farcical year for the Little West German team, as owner Gunter Schmidt made life difficult for his own men so often it almost seemed like sabotage. He got his own driver disqualified in Rio, lost the services of talented staff like designer Gustav Brunner, engineer Stefan Fober, and, ultimately, Manfred Winkelhock, and insisted on expanding to 2 cars when the team was struggling to cope with 1. The BMW engines also turned out to be a mixed blessing. The same issues that plagued the Brabham team, exacerbated by the team's lack of resources, and at the end of the season a Bavarian firm announced that they were cancelling their engine deal with ATS due to the bad publicity generated. That was enough for Schmidt, and a few weeks after the end of the season he announced that ATS would be withdrawing from Formula 1, and soon afterwards sold the ATS Alloy Wheels company as a whole. If there was one bright spot in all of this, both Winkelhock and Berger impressed among the chaos, with Manfred running as high as 3rd in Belgium, and Berger would have scored if he had been registered. Hopefully both can find better berths for next year. The Renault team hoped for a new start after the Prost years, and they got it, but not in the way they'd hoped. Their first winless year since 1978 saw the team being largely outclassed by their own customers, Lotus, and while the cars ran well they were thirsty, unreliable and fragile, with injuries to both drivers caused by seemingly innocuous shunts in Monaco and Belgium. Derek Warwick started brightly and ran second in the championship for a while, but seemed to lose heart later on, while Tombe simply had an awful season all round with all of the bad luck, though he did at least manage pole and second place at Dijon, and looked nailed on for the win at Monza until his car self-destructed again. Both drivers are eminently capable of winning races. Tombe was doing it for Ferrari just last year, but not in this equipment. A pretty grim season for Arrows, who started the year with the old chassis and Ford engines, and, thanks to Tyrrell's expulsion, managed to score 3 points with them. But the new A7 chassis wasn't as good, and the BMW engine when it arrived was no more reliable than it was for the Brabham or ATS teams. In the end they scored as many points with the new car as the old one, though at least they scored. Thierry Boutsen in his first full season of F1 made most of the running later on, while Sura seemed to lose confidence, and indeed, after the end of the season he announced his retirement from Formula 1. A shame for a driver who was undoubtedly better than the machinery he was given throughout his career, but understandable, and the popular Swiss driver will hope for better things in other categories. The rise of the Toleman team from no hopers in 1981 to the podium in 1984 has been one of the stories of recent years, and the team could, and many believe should, have scored their maiden win at Monaco. If the team's followers were worried they would implode without long-serving Derek Warwick, they needn't have been. Ayrton Senna hit the ground running and showed everyone why he was such a highly sought-after young man. Williams and Brabham might have regretted not offering him a race drive watching their own number 2 drivers slogging around in the midfield. Poor Johnny Cecotto always looked like a bit of an afterthought, and the team didn't exactly fall over themselves to replace him after his accident, which, sadly, looks like it has spelled the end for his top-class racing career. The Tiny Spirit team soldiered on into 1984 after their unceremonious dumping by Honda, with 15 staff, a can-do attitude, and a decent chassis by Gordon Coppock and Tim Wright. The Hart engine was a little underpowered compared to others, and the team had no money for testing or development, running mostly sponsor-free for the season. Under the circumstances, just making it to Portugal was an achievement in itself, and we'll see whether they can make it to the grid next year. Of their 2 drivers, Mauro Baldi was generally better than Hubroth-Ngata, but neither embarrassed themselves and did as well as could be expected on the meagre resources available. Alfa Romeo were another works team hoping for a clean sheet this year, with a new look, new drivers and new technical staff, but unfortunately for them it was more of the same, with Gustav Brunner's promising chassis weighed down by the overweight, underpowered and above all over-thirsty engine. When drivers Patrese and Chiva weren't bickering, they had the option of either turning the boost down and circulating in midfield, or actually trying to race and running out of fuel. Patrese generally chose the former, Chiva the latter, and it was Ricciardo who scored more points, but either way the car wasn't reliable enough for it to really make a difference. Osella improved in 1984, usually qualifying well enough and running safely in midfield, and scoring precious points at Dallas to boot. Unfortunately they had the same problem as the Alfa Romeo works team, thirsty and unreliable engines, and Gartner in particular seemed to run out of fuel in the closing stages. Both drivers looked cheerful enough, and maybe even Nigel Mansell won't have begrudged the affable Gonzani those points at Dallas, while toothy Viennese Gartner looked decent enough, though he did develop a reputation for being difficult to lap. An improvement from 1983, though perhaps not as much of one as Guy Ligier and co might have hoped for with the addition of the powerful Renault engines. Unfortunately, the JS23 chassis was a bit of a dog, and between the inexperience of Renault and De Cesaris' disinterest in development driving, they didn't manage to improve it much, despite spending a lot of resources on a JS23B chassis that never saw the light of day. Once again, Guy Ligier seems to have lost interest mid-season, and De Cesaris did too after some decent drives early on. Next year sees the return of team legend Jacques Laffite, but whether he can give them the extra oomph they need remains to be seen. That Ferrari was second in the Constructors' Championship after what was by most standards a pretty average season suggests that McLaren's dominance was at least in part due to everyone else having a bad year. The red cars looked like contenders early on, but never seemed to figure out what they'd been doing right in Belgium that they got wrong everywhere else. Arnoux started well with 3 podiums in the first 6 races, but he looked demotivated and anonymous for most of the rest of the season, while Alboreto got better and better as he got the measure of the team and the car. Michele had the lion's share of the broken cars, and a couple of unforced spins showed he still had a lot to learn, but at the end of the season, although he was only 3.5 points ahead of Renault in the standings, he came away looking like he'd absolutely demolished his teammate. Both drivers are contracted for 1985, but there are rumours that technical director Mauro Forghieri might be on his way, and another round of the political infighting that plagues Ferrari whenever they aren't winning regularly beckons.